Welcome to the Non-Human and AI Identity podcast. By humans, for humans, no AI-generated content. Hi, I'm Lalit Choda, founder of the Non-Human Identity Management Group. On this brand new podcast show, I'll be hosting the leading voices shaping the future of non-human and agentic AI identity. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Non-Human and AI Identity podcast. I'm excited to have Shashwat Sehgal, CEO and founder of P0, join me for this episode. Shashwat, why don't you just share a brief intro and maybe something interesting that people may not know about you?
Certainly, always good to meet you, Lalit. For those of you who may not know, I'm Shashwat. I'm the founder and CEO here at P0 Security. We started the company a little over 3 years ago, and our goal is to reinvent privileged access management for users, for non-human identities, for agentic identities, and help organizations move to a world of zero standing privileges and zero static credentials. One thing which people may not know about me is that I play a lot of tennis.
Okay.
Maybe not so much anymore, given the demands of startup life, but definitely there was a time when I used to play 4 or 5 times a week.
Oh, nice. There was a time I used to play badminton, similar time as well. But yes, as a founder myself, that kind of was long distant history. Okay, before we get into main discussion, Shashwat, we're going to start with Mr. NHI's human identity in the hot seat. I'm going to fire 10 machine speed questions on IAM, non-human and AI identities. So let's go. Right. Will static long-lived credentials secrets still exist in 5 years?
I really want to say no, but unfortunately, the answer here is yes. We humans have a tendency to be lazy and not do away with bad practices for far too long. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be any different with this AI wave coming along. And static long-lived credentials, if anything, they are going to be even more amplified with this huge surge of AI-generated code, of local MCPs and agents running locally just about everywhere. And I'm going to go out and predict that not only is it still going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem at a much larger scale in 5 years.
Yeah, I would fully agree. Okay, are enterprises finally making NHI risk management a top priority?
It's an interesting question. For pretty much every enterprise that I've spoken to over the last year and a half, the evolution has been somewhat as follows. The first few months were, what is an NHI? It slowly became, okay, yes, it's a problem, but so what? It's been festering around for 30 years, right? It's like one of those things, nobody died of it. And suddenly, especially with the explosion of these agentic identities, Claudebot, Moltbot, it's slowly getting to the point where it's a hair on fire moment,
Oh,
right? And there have been a lot of early adopters who've wanted to clean the NHI problem, and I suspect it's only going to get worse, more and more and more and more prevalent over the next over the rest of 2026.
right. Okay, and does agentic AI security equal NHI security?
I don't think it equals NHI security. I think NHI security is a lot broader than agentic security. Uh, there are a lot of machines which have nothing to do with agents. Uh, but at the same time, I'd say agentic security is probably the most pressing subset of NHI security, and it's definitely the subset that is going to increase or grow the fastest over the next few years. Right? So
Yep.
for any enterprise to coming back to one of your previous questions, uh, for any enterprise that is looking to make NHI risk management a top priority, it makes a lot of sense to start off with agentic AI security, right? Because maybe you can deprioritize things like Active Directory service accounts because they've been around for a very long time, right? But there is this entirely new attack surface that is opening up in agentic land, and this is the subset that CISOs need to be concerned about the most at the moment.
Okay. Are organizations putting time to market ahead of security controls for AI agents?
Yes, and unfortunately, this is history. As I like to say, history doesn't repeat, but it surely rhymes, right? And just about every technology wave, be it cloud, within cloud, be it Kubernetes, be it mobile, it always follows the same predictable pattern. Time to market is always the first thing to happen as organizations test new technologies. Um they see what's possible, they see what's not possible, they take shortcuts, they put something into production. That's always the first step. Second step is always, okay, how do we observe? We put in monitoring and observability into this technology. And then the third step is, okay, now it's time to secure, right? And these three steps always happen in sequence, never in parallel.
Hmm.
There is, as I like to say, there is a reason Wiz happened 5 to 10 years after Datadog, right? Because there was nothing to secure before that in the cloud. Yeah, right. You have to
Hmm.
get to market, you have to observe and monitor. Only then can you secure. And many times, in fact, not many times, in fact, pretty much all of the time, that is almost always too late. And I suspect the same thing is going to happen with agentic.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Are CISOs ready for the fleets of autonomous digital employees?
Great question. They're getting there. I don't think some of the more forward-looking ones that I've spoken to have put in very robust security programs for all of their agentic identities. But I don't think the vast majority of the market is anywhere near those early adopters. They still require time. They still require maturity. They are watching and observing. And I think over the next few years, there's going to be a wave of innovation. Um, After agents have already been deployed, they've been in production. They've been um, People have observed what the security incidents could look like. Once we hit that point, there'll be an absolute wave of CISOs preparing themselves for this feat of agentic employees.
Okay. Can zero standing privilege work for NHIs and agents?
I'd argue it's the only way to make it work. Not that it, not can they work, not can ZSP work. It's the only way to make it work. Because if you think about it, it's very simple. It no matter what identity exists in an enterprise, there are only two problems that enterprise need to solve for those identities. There is the authentication problem. How do we make sure they have a dynamic credential that is not long-lived? And that's a strong credential. And then there's the authorization problem, right? And authorization problem loosely translates to, hey, give that identity a least privileged role at inception and then validate that identity's permissions at runtime,
Hmm.
right? And let's focus on the authorization for a little bit, on the authorization problem. For an agent, it's nearly impossible to know what is the right privileges they require at inception, because the number of actions an agent can take is so broad.
Hmm.
In fact, it's non-deterministic, right? And similarly, at runtime, it's almost well nigh impossible to ascertain with any certainty that, hey, the permissions they have right now, are they accurate or not? So what I argue is that instead of doing it the way that we've done it for humans, is this role the correct role or not? The only way, because of the non-determinism and the sheer amount of combinations of permissions in any modern cloud slash SaaS environment, uh, the only way to secure agentic is to ensure that they have ZSP at all times, not just at inception, but also at
Hmm.
runtime.
Okay. Look, I'm sure we're going to discuss this a little bit more through the show. Let's move on. Is the recent market activity involving identity vendors a good thing for the industry?
Absolutely. The industry deserves a lot of choice, a lot of innovation, because that's the only way to solve this problem. And the recent market activity, including the funding announcements, the acquisition announcements, and in general, all the innovation happening amongst the ton of identity vendors. Not only is that a good thing, but I think that is necessary to make sure that we are ahead of this problem collectively as an industry.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think regulators will move fast enough to keep up with agentic AI?
Nope, but I'm sure the industry will.
Cool. Look, I think the last two questions you've probably covered, but in some way. But look, are we repeating the past mistakes of managing NHIs now with AI agents?
Unfortunately, we are. Yeah, I had more confidence. We are not, but we definitely are.
Okay, and look, the final question again, I think we've touched on it a little bit. Does PAM dramatically change the introduction with agentic AI agents?
Yeah, great question. And yes, absolutely. PAM has conclusively evolved away from an era of managing vaults and bastion hosts. Um, Increasingly, PAM is about managing authorization, zero standing privileges, and eliminating static credentials altogether. And not only will that continue, I think that will accelerate with the introduction of agentic.
Perfect. All right, I hope you enjoyed being in the hot seat, Shashwat. There was great insights there, and I think this is a good segue for our main topic today. So, look, the theme for today is modern PAM for human and NHIs in the AI era, where we'll discuss kind of emerging trends that are reshaping, PAM, security, identity management as we know it. So look, I want to start with the evolution of PAM over the years and the solutions as they evolved, for humans, non-humans, all the way to kind of the modern PAM approach, right, with zero standing privileges, just in time, and how, agentic AI agents kind of changes the game. But before I let you sort of take the audience through that, I'll just share my own kind of personal experience, kind of starting off in investment banking. I guess my first experience was probably about 25, 28 years ago. I was running order management systems globally at a big investment bank. And we were a large kind of Solaris kind of Unix shop where we would have to, sudo su to an application technical account. I guess these days we now call them NHIs. So, as a human, we could, become, impersonate that technical account, log on to the box, run scripts, and do support, as we were troubleshooting, supporting the application. So I guess that was my first experience of PAM 25 plus years ago. Probably about 10 years later, I actually was involved in specing an in-house PAM solution that I actually coined TAP, where we would tap into production, again, for pseudo SU, but this time based on a role-based access control model, where, you would link, applications to assets, to servers, and then that would control your access. And then more recently, at another bank, we actually worked on a high-level design of a PAM solution, kind of with an RBAC model for infrastructure access, and that actually was built on a just-in-time model for granting privileges to servers and databases. So I can say I've got a little bit of experience in PAM over my 25, 30-year career. But look, why don't you take the audience through how PAM evolved from those early days? You mentioned kind of vaults and stuff. Like let's talk through the journey right of whether we call it PAM 1.0, PAM 2.0, before we talk about kind of what modern PAM needs to look like.
Yeah, no, a great question. And as I think about it, PAM has followed an evolution in three phases, right? And broadly, I'll call it Gen 1 PAM, which was based on vaults, Gen 2 PAM, which was based on bastions and network controls, and Gen 3 PAM, which is where we are, which is based on authorization controls. Gen 1 PAM, and before we get into the specifics, PAM has always been about securing access to hypersensitive systems in an environment in any enterprise. Those sensitive systems could usually be server. servers, databases, virtual machines, uh, s- you know, SaaS, anywhere where extremely sensitive data might reside, and you need to make sure that the access to that data is strictly on an as needed basis. It's short-lived, and any activity to satisfy is recorded to satisfy audit requirements, right? That is what
Mm,
PAM usually means. So when this f space first emerged in the aftermath of the Sarbanes-Oxley, uh, um, requirements of the late 1990s, early 2000s,
mm,
um, at the time, enterprise architectures looked very different. In almost every instance, there was a data center. The keys to the kingdom or the privileged assets were physical servers, physical databases within that data center.
mm,
Each of them had a root account, which was typically linked to a non-human identity,
mm,
and getting access to those environments usually meant, hey, take this NHI, take its password, share it with whoever needs to access that asset. And hence the technology that emerged was that of a password manager. We now call that a vault,
yeah.
right? So the early CyberArk vaults, the secret servers at the time, championed by Thycotic, now Delinea, Beyond Trust, etc. They were all loosely based on a very similar technology, which was that of a password manager,
Mm.
which is take a static credential, put it in a vault, make sure it's completely obfuscated from the end user, rotate it when in use, and that's about it, right? And this is what I call Gen 1 PAM. And the idea here was that it's based on authentication based controls, which is that of passwords, right?
Mm.
And this is how the problem of NHIs first started becoming mainstream. But it was mostly constrained because the number of NHIs was usually just limited to the number of root accounts in all of these different systems, and the number of these systems were not that many as compared to end users, because it was really just constrained to the number of these boxes in a physical data center.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because like when I talk about my first experience 25 years ago, that was directly because of SOX. And one of the requirements there was you had to cycle your,
Yeah,
well, in those days, database passwords every 180 days. But
yeah,
look, as everyone knows, cycling passwords for NHIs is a nightmare because typically hard coded. And I actually, 25 years ago, built my own first PAM solution in-house at
yeah.
this bank. And again, it was, as you said, a password manager. So it's bringing back all those memories from 25 years ago of how the vaults initially started life. But yeah, look, carry on.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of us have lived that reality, right? And then what was the next innovation? The next innovation was in the early years of the cloud. Um, what changed? What changed was that the sensitive assets for every enterprise now began moving into the cloud. There were virtual machines and databases everywhere. Excuse me. Yeah. Um, and these they were the number of these virtual machines, databases, eventually Kubernetes clusters, they exploded, and they were also ephemeral, right? What that meant was the same vault-like model wasn't easy to deploy. Why wasn't it easy to deploy? Because a vault or a password manager fundamentally assumes that the thing that you're requesting a password to exists at all times, right? Because you have a password to it, and that password doesn't change. Or, but if you can imagine, the machine itself is ephemeral. It spins up, spins down. All of a sudden, you realize that the passwords that you are putting into a vault, they are not relevant anymore, right? In other words, the size of the vault needs to expand dramatically, and it also needs to be able to it needs to expand dramatically because there are a lot more of these machines and databases. Plus, it also needs to be able to handle ephemeral infrastructure. Um, this is when problems started emerging around the whole vault-based model, right? It was a pain in the in the you know where to manage.
Mm,
Um, and it also didn't meet the demands of cloud environments. So what people decided to do was, okay, instead of gating access to every asset one by one, let's put in some kind of a bastion at the edge of the network, and let's just control access to this bastion, right? So they've constrained the problem. How have they constrained the problem? Instead of putting uh, credentials to, let's say, 1,000 different machines uh, on the vault, what they're doing is they're only putting the credentials to one machine inside the vault. That one machine, that bastion is static. And now, if if an IT or a developer person wants access to any database, they first have to log into the vault using the credential that's stored in the they first have to log into the bastion using the credential that's stored on the vault, and from that bastion they can get access to anything else on the network. In other words, um, Gen 2 PAM was a mixture of network-based controls using bastions and authn-based controls using vaults.
yeah, like jump servers and stuff,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly, exactly. Except that this was also very painful to manage. Why was it very painful to manage? The user experience was obnoxious, right? You have to maintain infrastructure, you had to maintain uh, and deploy infrastructure, which became cost prohibitive after a while. You had standing privileges everywhere, right? Once you were on the bastion, you had standing access to whatever it is on the network. Uh, and it it was a first cut solution, but it just wasn't good enough to meet the demands of the cloud. Um, so yeah, I mean, a combination of poor user experience, the fa poor security model because you had static access, standing privileges everywhere, and the fact that the cloud kept evolving, but the technology did not, meant that there was a need for a next gen PAM, which was based not on network based controls, not on authn based controls, but on authorization based controls. In other words, next gen PAM is where you manage authorization to a target system, uh, and you provision just in time, short lived access authorization without requiring any static credentials, right? And you completely eliminate the need to deploy any infrastructure within a customer environment, and that is where we are right now, right?
I guess
And
before we just get there, Shashwat, I mean, I think there's probably a few other sort of scenarios that are probably worth sharing with the audience, right? Many people probably do know the story and evolution of PAM, but also from a kind of human PAM standpoint, yes, they needed to get access to the root account or pseudo to a technical account or whatever. But also, regulators around the world, would state, look, every individual must have their own identity, and in some cases, like a privileged identity. So at various banks I worked at, you would have multiple accounts, right? One for your own identity and then one for privileged access that might allow you to get access to multiple databases or multiple servers, right? So I think that was also part of, again, the same problem. You're creating static privileged credentials, but they were tied directly to individuals, which again was an absolute nightmare to manage. But again, typically sort of password based. Any comments, thoughts on that angle you wanted to kind of share or add some perspectives on?
yeah, no, I mean, I think you called it out really well, right? The entire password based PAM, um, it assumed that a password is sufficient to secure access. And similarly, a network-based PAM assumed that network controls are enough to secure access. And increasingly, in a world where privileged access is everywhere, there are identities everywhere. Having those authn and network-based controls are not enough. And what you really need are authorization-based controls for every identity,
Oh,
right? So that you
yeah.
can truly get to a point where you have zero standing privileges and just enough access for every user, machine, and agent.
Look, I think before you can obviously get to that specific point, I guess also, you talked about cloud and how that changed things, how we ended up with kind of hyper fragmentation. Yes, we had all the traditional passwords, kind of the service accounts, right? But then obviously with SaaS-based services, right, we then get into the lovely world of API keys and tokens, and you referred to Claude Bot and stuff. The Mobile kind of breach where 1.5 million agent API keys kind of were kind of discovered, right? So clearly that again changed the game, right? I guess you could argue, is that PAM, is that not PAM, right? But clearly that was the growth of NHIs as we know it today with those other types of categories, and I guess clearly API keys are just another glorified password effectively, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, all right. So look, why don't we then talk about kind of what is needed, right? What like what is then the next gen, right? The modern PAM solution, right? What does that look like? You've obviously touched on it a little bit. Maybe let's talk about, zero standing privileges just in time, right? And how does that change the game? And why is that so critical, as we start, deploying kind of agentic AI based solutions, across the industry?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, um, if we work backwards from the end goal of a PAM, which is to secure access to sensitive data and or sensitive systems, uh, in a world where sensitive data and sensitive systems are everywhere and identities are everywhere. There are a lot more identities than before. Many of these are ephemeral, short-lived. Infrastructure is ephemeral, short-lived. The first premise is that vault-based controls or network-based controls are just not sufficient.
Mm,
The model that we need to work backwards from is to secure access at the layer of authorization. I like to think of this in terms of a very simple mathematical equation. Access is equal to connectivity, which is at the network layer, plus authentication, plus authorization, right? And Gen 1 was all about authn, Gen 2 was about connectivity, and Gen 3 is increasingly about authorization, right? So working backwards from this reality, uh, the next gen PAM needs to help get to a state of zero standing privileges for every identity, whether it's a user, whether it's a workload, whether it's an agent. Organizations should have a straightforward way to use this PAM to specify, hey, for this such and such identity, this is the only privilege that we want at inception. And then at runtime, um, the PAM should gather all the context from activity. It should gather context from what is the agent actually trying to do. It should make a determination in real time whether that authorization or that access should be allowed or not. And if the answer is yes, then it should escalate its privileges just in time. Uh, it should escalate them in a just enough fashion, not more, not less, and it should escalate them for long enough for it to complete that action. And after that time period, that access or that authorization should be revoked, right? In other words, access should always be around zero standing privileges, and it should always be just enough privileges, and it should always do so without any static credentials anywhere.
yeah. I mean, you made a great point there about at inception or when the workload kind of instantiates, right? It should just have enough permissions to kind of start up, operate. But then the key is, at the point where it needs to actually do some work, right? It then needs to kind of authorize based on its intent and context, which clearly with autonomous agents, having that more kind of runtime authorization model, right, is key. Like clearly, kind of with the more static workloads we had in the past, we kind of knew what they were doing, what they were connecting to, right? So you could, effectively get all that information up front, right? All the authorization kind of information, what privileges, but clearly that model, just clearly doesn't work from an agentic standpoint. Why don't you just talk through that a little bit more, just explain to the audience why kind of AI agents, agentic AI changes that game and why we need to really think completely differently, right, about kind of moving to that runtime authorization model.
Ultimately, it's around the fact that two things, right? First, the complexity of modern environments is such that it's very difficult to determine at the outset, at inception, what is the permission an agent should have.
Mm,
If you ask any developer that is building an agent right now, 99.9% they are saying, okay, let's just give it a broad role and worry about it later,
yeah.
right? The problem is with this approach is that the worry about it later almost never happens. Uh, and then the second new problem that is being emerged in this model is that access is or actions of an agent are inherently non-deterministic, and this is especially true for autonomous agents, right? Um, which makes it all the more difficult to know what the permissions at inception should be. Which makes it all the more imperative that if you just fundamentally cannot determine the the permissions of an identity at the outset, the solution isn't to get more data to identify what the right role should be. Because this is so fundamental, what I'm arguing is you just cannot make that determination. And
Mm,
if you cannot make that determination, the only solution is to give them absolutely zero privileges at inception, right? Let me take a concrete example. One customer that we have seen, they are a financial services company. They are building a customer support agent, right?
mm,
And let's say that they have around 100,000 customers. I'm just making up a number here. Should that customer support agent have access to the data for every 100,000 customers? But surely the answer to that is no, right?
mm.
But then at inception, how many customers should they have access to? Well, do you even know what support tickets are going to come in? You don't, right? So if the answer is not 100,000, and if the answer is not something that you can determine at inception, the only solution here is it should have access to no customer data at inception, and the determination needs to be made at runtime. How do you make this at runtime? You gather context and you give that agent just enough privileges at runtime. What is the context that needs to be gathered? When this agent is invoked at runtime, the context is there a customer support ticket for any particular customer open or not,
Mm,
right? And let's say five customer support tickets are open. Then at runtime, the determination that needs to be made is okay, if we are going to increase the privileges of this agent for let's say an hour, long enough for this agent to do its work, but only for it to gain short-lived access to these five customer data. And after it has solved the support case, then its access should be revoked. Right? This is the only model that works. Nothing else works in this agentic world. purely because you just cannot make the determination at outset, and also because the actions are fundamentally um, non-deterministic. You just don't know which agent it will, which customer's data it will require at any point.
Yeah, let's zone in on that, right? Because like pre, agentic agent world, right? You would have some workload, right? That may be performing the same activities, right? Dealing with support tickets. And historically, you would have given those NHIs kind of full keys to the kingdom, right?
Mm.
Because it would need to deal with many different tickets and it would need to be able to access, the data. But like, I guess there, like the access was gated, right? There was a clear interface API, right? There was only one way to get in. And then, it was very deterministic, right? What the paths it could take. So maybe it was okay to give it those kind of very broad privileges. What is it about kind of agentic AI or AI agents more broadly, right, that increases that risk of why you really need to have zero privileges for that kind of agent to begin with? I mean, obviously we talked about being non-deterministic, but look, I'm sure there's other risk factors, right, like prompt injection and many other things that have been called out, right, from kind of the OWASP agentic applications top 10, right?
I mean, yeah, you hit the nail on the head, right? If it's in an earlier world where it was just a service account, what's the threat model? The threat model is a malicious actor can impersonate as that service account. They can steal its credential, or they can assume its role, um, and then act as that service account. All right. So the threat was, hey, does this NHI have a static credential, or does this NHI have long-standing privileges? What new thing has been inserted because of agentic? Prompt injection for sure, as you mentioned, but also the fact that it's non-deterministic, and also the fact that it can chain actions to other agents. And both of these have made the have increased the blast radius of agentic identities as compared to the other NHIs like service accounts that used to exist before, right? In other words, the threat vectors are still the same.
Hmm.
Is the agent using static credentials, or does the agent have overprivileged access? But the blast radius of those and the urgency of those have increased a lot because of the non-deterministic nature, as well as the other risks like prompt injection associated with agents.
Great. Look, this is kind of a fascinating area. I think about it literally every day. And the thing that I kind of struggle with, or maybe you can enlighten, me and the audience, right? You've talked about, no privileges at inception, right? You then need to do authorization at runtime. You could have a human calling an agent, you could have an agent calling an agent, and then a human in the loop, right? So there's so many different use cases, right? And you don't know until the agent decides to do what it needs to do in a maybe non-deterministic way, what it might need, right? How do you model that, right, from a policies, rules standpoint, right? I don't know, like, for example, do we even have, proper standards, designs, solutions today that can help model that complex, human to agent to agent to agent, kind of interaction in a very non-deterministic way. So look, maybe that's also then a good segue to maybe sharing a little bit about kind of P0, what you're doing, and maybe as part of that, share your thoughts around how you can sort of model kind of the policies and the rules for managing this new complex autonomous world.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, everything begins from being able to put in pol. There are three components to a next gen PAM, if you will, right? Or as we say, it's a control plane for authorization, right? Next gen PAM, we call it as a control plane for authorization. And there are three components to this. The first component is you should be able to enter the policy that you want for those agents in a manner that covers all of your sensitive data and other digital real estate, right? That policy could just be as simple as, hey, any identity, any agent should not have standing access to this snowflake table. Ju- Just laying out an example. So that's the first component, the ability to write policy. The second the second component of PAM is the ability to evaluate policy at runtime. What does this mean? Going back to our hypothetical example of a customer service agent that has access to 100,000 different customer data, the evaluation step here would gather context from various different data sources, from various different systems. For example, a ticketing system that says that, hey, such and such customer has an outstanding support request, right? Just an example, context can be gathered from many other sources.
Mm.
And then the PAM system makes a determination at runtime whether to allow a particular access or not, right? Based on the context, based on the fact that, hey, is there a standing access policy defined or not? If not, uh, should this agent have authorization based on uh, this shared context from a variety of other systems? And last but not the least, the PAM system actually enforces that policy in a least privileged manner while maintaining zero standing privileges without requiring any static credentials, right? So it's the culmination of these three sub problems that will define a PAM like P0, uh, help make um, first is help write policy for ZSP for an agent. Second, make an evaluation at runtime based on the shared context from a variety of different systems.
Mm.
And last but not the least, enforce that policy in a manner that is consistent with ZSP, with JIT, with just-in-time privileges, and which completely eliminates static credentials. That is the way to go.
Do you see a world where we would have to like define, for example, that this agent can talk to only these three agents, or do you think, given the dynamic nature, that an agent could just discover what's within the ecosystem or outside and decide to connect to anything and everything it needs to perform its tasks? And how do you then write policies and rules around that type of scenario?
Yeah, so absolutely. We absolutely need to guide against that scenario. Uh, how do we do that? We Using a PAM, you absolutely have to define policies which specify the zero standing privileges of an agent, right? Which means that by default, the zero trust model assumes that the agent should not have access willy-nilly to anything and everything under the sun,
Mm.
right? And that is a core pillar of the PAM model for all of these agentic identities.
Great. And again, just then, do you want to maybe share a little bit about kind of P0 and how you're moving towards that direction?
Yeah, I mean, we this is how we are architecting our system, which is that whether it's a user, whether it's an NHI, or whether it's an agent, an enterprise needs a next gen PAM like P0 to be able to secure PAM or privileged access for that identity. And the way they would do this is by those three components that I talked about. First is define the policies that you require in your environment, right? ZSP by design, or at the very minimum, as few privileges as possible. Then evaluation at runtime. Hey, at runtime, should XYZ identity have just-in-time access? Should they have any access based on context from a variety of different systems? And last but not the least, enforcement of authorization in a just-in-time ZSP, zero static credentials manner, right? That is fundamentally what PAM and even more broadly access security looks like in agentic world, right?
Mm.
Make sure every action is ZSP. Make sure every action is tied to a core identity. There are no static credentials anywhere, and all access is just in time by design.
Yeah, look, I'm sure we could spend hours talking about this, moving to kind of a real-time, just-in-time model, all sounds like the way to go, right? Obviously it adds other complexities around kind of then having to then have highly scalable, resilient kind of PAM solutions that don't, when you need to authorize for every action, right? You need that high availability solution where before it was all get your privileges up front, right? So it's a huge paradigm shift, and I think it's going to put some interesting implications on the modern PAM solution. So look, excited to see how you and the industry evolve that, and you need to deliver that pretty fast, right? Given the way AI is moving today, and if we don't have those modern PAM solutions, right, we're going to continue to create the massive issues we've already got with NHIs today and static credentials and all those problems, but they're just going to get 10 times worse. Look, fascinating discussion. Look, as we close, maybe share for the audience, for organizations, what would be the two, three bits of advice you would give around kind of agentic AI, PAM, to take away, what would they, what should they take away from this episode?
The problem, I'd say three things. First, the problem is real, and like with every other technology wave that has happened in the last 10 years, security people need to get ahead of it before it becomes too big. Secondly, the problem is fundamentally about authorization. I
Mm.
won't say it's about identity. Yes, it's about identity, but even specifically within identity, it's around authorization. And you need a model which stresses on ZSP, which eliminates static credentials, and which um, gives organizations a pathway for just-in-time access depending on the context at runtime. Um, and last but not the least, the old world solutions like vaults, like network-based controls, are absolutely the wrong way to secure the pending agentic wave that is coming up in every enterprise across the planet.
Yeah. Look, one of the things as I hear that, and as we said at the beginning, one of the questions, right? Do we stick with the thing we're going to have static credentials in 5 years, 10 years time? Clearly, as we've got to a much more hyper-fragmented environment, with on-prem, multi-cloud, SaaS, right, and now agentic, right? I guess part of that PAM challenge, right, is going to be dealing with that hybrid world, right, where yes, an agent ideally should be, you know, no initial privileges. It shouldn't, it should have everything just in time, but unfortunately, some of the things it needs to connect to, right, may not follow those principles, right? And you may still have static services, static identities, even, God forbid, passwords, right, that you need to use. And we're seeing that obviously with the Mobile breach, right, where everybody's using agent API keys, right? So I think we've got a fascinating challenge ahead of us of, how do we deal with that kind of highly fragmented environment, right? That isn't going to change soon. So definitely, I think that modern PAM needs to be, I think, you know, meet those requirements you've presented, but still support some of that unfortunate legacy. Would you tend to agree with that, or have any final
Yeah, I mean,
closing thoughts?
it's the age-old question, right? When a new technology wave comes along, do you need something that is custom for it? What happens to all the investments that you've already made in the last 2 decades?
Mm.
Um, and look, the reality is that as enterprise systems get more and more complicated and convoluted, the yes, there is a platformization story. We'd all want nothing better than one vendor to deal with everything that ever elusive single pane of glass for just
Yeah.
about every risk under the sun, right? And to be sure, people like Palo Alto have made a lot of good steps in that direction, right? But I think there'll always be a need, especially in for urgent problems, for best of breed solutions. Because the reality is best of breed solutions move faster than legacy solutions, especially for problems that are urgent, that are new, and nothing's going to change that, right? And that is something that every organization needs to evaluate whether this problem is big enough, it's urgent enough to merit a best of breed new innovative player. And I think for a lot of organizations, that answer is going to be a yes.
Yeah, look, it's the question I'm sure is on every board member's mind or CISO's mind, as they're all trying to beat the arms race, right, and get, ahead before the competition sweeps them up. So look, it's a fascinating space. And, if people want to know a little bit more about P0, where do they go?
Uh, they should connect with me on email or on LinkedIn or go to our website. It's www.p0.dev. Um, we'd be happy to speak to them. We are happy to speak to anyone who wants to modernize their PAM architecture, and we are looking forward to it.
All right, Shashwat, as always, a real pleasure. Really enjoyed this chat. Hopefully see you soon at maybe RSA next month. Look, we've got some great content coming up on our podcast. But if you'd like to learn more, watch our show, the Non-Human and AI Identity podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and even now TikTok as well, under Mr. NHI. And also visit our portal, nhimg.org, where we have over 2,000 articles all about non-human identities and agentic AI. And if you want to get trained up on how to manage NHIs and the new agentic world, also look at nhitraining.org. Okay, with that, Shashwant, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure. Um, Thanks, everyone.